Hi there, I'm Haruka. So this is a rough week for me. I've got a bunch of really cool ideas that need to be timed out perfectly for when they release, so I need to make some filler stuff to go in between. But I don't want to make things that aren't fun, so I was struggling with what to make a video on. Then I realized that one of the goals of this channel was to teach weebs about sports. Like real life sports. I just did a video about a baseball anime, and right now the biggest sports event is spring training. Sorry, NBA All-Star Game. So I guess it's about time to do an introductory video to the world of baseball. I think that this is something I might be able to do in the future, so if you're interested in more of these about other major sports, tell me in the comments. So let's see where this goes. So, baseball. There's a lot of basic stuff you probably know, right? 9 players on a team, but really it's just a series of 1v1 battles between the pitcher and the batter. The rest of the defense is there just in case the batter actually hits it. There's 4 balls, 3 strikes, 3 outs, and that's the end of the inning. If the batter hits the ball, you gotta catch it in the air before it hits the ground, otherwise you gotta tag them, and that's all 9 innings. Each team gets 3 outs. We know all this already. But did you also realize that there's a glitch in this system where it is technically possible for a baseball game to go on indefinitely if the pitching team can't get 3 outs? So that means that even if a team is winning 15-0 in the first inning, without 3 outs, the game wouldn't move on to the second inning. Something to keep you up at night. Let's move on to the fun stuff, which is the origins of baseball. After the past couple of weeks, I should probably just change my bio to amateur baseball historian with how much I've had to research. Anyway, as it turns out, hitting a ball with a stick and running around isn't a very complicated concept, and that sort of thing has been a children's game since the early 1700s. But baseball as we know it really wouldn't start taking shape until the Knickerbocker rules of 1845. As with everything in history, there's evidence that this wasn't the first rule system and may not even have been the first rule system to use these rules. But for the purposes of this video, I do not care about that debate. The Knickerbocker rules established 3 strikes, 3 outs, foul lines, and batting orders. There are also some other things, like how they would still give you an out if you caught it after only a single bounce. They actually didn't have outfield fences, so the playing area was considered an infinite plane between the foul line. Speaking of infinity, the Knickerbocker rules said that the game was meant to only be first to 21 points, thus fixing the infinite lives bug in the modern game. By the mid-1850s, the New York area got really into baseball, and because it was such a local phenomenon, local journalists started calling baseball the national pastime. This would begin a very dumb history of over-exaggeration in the importance of the sport. But this brought about an official league in 1857. But that league was racist and wouldn't make it as a professional league. It eventually transformed into the independent leagues and minor leagues. The National League was founded in 1876. They were also racist. In 1893, most of the rules of baseball were solidified and the American League was founded. Still racist. In 1903, they decided to have a championship game between the National League and the American League. This was a national championship series for 2 leagues based in the US, and they called it the World Series because nothing will stop baseball from over-exaggerating. And in 1920, black people just got tired of waiting for baseball to stop being racist and just made their own leagues. It took a couple of tries, but they ended up producing some of the greatest players in the history of the game. 1920 also marked the arrival of Babe Ruth and the end of the dead ball era. Just so you know, the time periods in baseball are referred to as eras. So before the dead ball era was the barnstorming era. The next era would be the integration era, but the time between the end of the dead ball era and the start of the integration era doesn't have a name for some reason. It's just kind of the time that Babe Ruth played, and that was it. The important thing is that before 1920, baseball was literally designed to not be exciting. No one hit home runs because stadiums were just too big, and batting in itself was so stupidly hard because the balls weren't designed very well, and were reused to the point that they just sort of fell dead off of players' bats. Like, they literally used balls until they wore out because no one in the Professional Baseball League head office wanted to buy new balls. And that absolutely tanked the sport's fun value. So Babe Ruth and his heavy hitting broke past that. And around this time, minor league teams started to become a real thing as pro teams would buy up independent teams so they could develop young players without using them in their real games. Then there was a fun little side quest during World War II when they had a women's league because all the men were off at war. But that only lasted for 10 years and the misogyny kicked back in. Speaking of bigotry, in 1947 someone decided to actually check if the whole racism thing in MLB was a rule or just a suggestion. And funny enough, it was only a suggestion and Jackie Robinson kicked off the integration era. Most historians believe that the actual start of integration was somewhere in the 1950s, but let's face it, racism never left MLB. So with that, let's stop talking about American baseball. All the rest you need to know is that they nerfed pitching in 1969, established free agency in 1975, and then there's the steroid era from the early 90s to the mid 2000s. What I want to do is take you guys on a field trip, a baseball field trip. Our first stop, and honestly my favorite, is Cuba. Cuba as a country was a Spanish colony for a really long time because pretty much every island in the Caribbean was a Spanish colony except for like Jamaica and Haiti, which also belonged to other empires. So baseball wasn't that big in Cuba, but it was certainly bigger than bullfighting. And for some reason, the local Spanish governors thought that baseball was dangerous because they ended up outlawing baseball in 1869. Eventually, the Spanish-American War happened and American culture flooded onto the island, fueling interest in baseball further. So with its close ties to American capitalism, you'd think that baseball would be tossed aside by the Cuban Revolution, which rejected anything deemed as American. But this is where the story gets so incredibly fascinating. This is a topic for an entirely different video and probably an entirely different person to talk about, but the opposite happened for baseball. Fidel Castro grew up loving baseball, and baseball in itself was actually viewed as a revolutionary activity, especially given its anti-imperialist history from back during the original Cuban Revolution 100 years prior when it was outlawed by Spain. So while professional sports were abolished in Cuba, amateur sports were encouraged and baseball became bigger than ever. I told you, this was the fun one. Another big baseball country to know about in the Caribbean is the Dominican Republic. Really, it follows a similar story to the start of the Cuban baseball story, with it being brought over in the 1870s by Cuban refugees and later amplified when Americans began occupying the country in the 1910s. Baseball had grown so much that the moment integration finally started taking hold in MLB, most clubs actually looked to the Dominican Republic and Cuba for the next stars of the game. And that's the way it's been ever since. Baseball is the national sport, and Dominicans make up the second highest population in Major League Baseball outside of Americans. So let's swing over to the country that you all probably want to hear me talk about, Japan. I know my audience is made up of weebs, and there are many weebs who actually watch NPB. Baseball made it over to Japan in 1872, this time being introduced by an American professor teaching at some academy in Tokyo. But instead of it spreading when Americans occupied the country, it spread when an all-Japanese team beat a team of foreigners in 1896. This made those players instant national heroes and spread the sport all throughout the country as others hoped to emulate the team that finally beat America at its own game. Wow, that phrasing is kind of dangerous. Anyway, instead of talking about professional baseball in Japan, the current league was founded back in 1950, I want to talk about high school baseball in Japan, which is comparable to NCAA football and basketball in America. There are 2 nationwide tournaments every season, with the finals for both of those taking place at Koshien Stadium, which is around Kobe. Because of this, the tournaments are simply referred to as Koshien. The 2 tournaments weren't founded at the same time, but they were both already going strong by the 1930s, with the older of the 2 going since the 1910s. The first tournament is the Invitational, which is known as Spring Koshien since it takes place in the spring. It's also called Senbatsu. This tournament consists of 32 teams that earn invites to the tournament, although sometimes there's 36 teams. Anyway, the big one is Summer Koshien, which is the full national championship. Third years are actually barred from playing at Spring Koshien, so this is the last stand for all the senpais. Overall, it's a much larger tournament, but in the end, it's 49 teams that actually get to play at Koshien Stadium for the championship. That's enough history, time for some practical knowledge. Strategy is a conversation for a different and more in-depth video, as if this video wasn't in-depth enough already. When you're watching baseball or reading up on it, there's a lot of phrases and random letters that may not make sense. Some are important, others aren't. Here are some that are important. First off, just the really simple stuff. H is hits, K's are strikeouts, BB is based on balls or a walk in a normal conversation, RBI stands for runs batted in, basically the runs that were directly scored due to that batter's hit. SB is stolen bases, and BA is the batting average. A good baseline for a player's batting average is what's known as the Mendoza line. Anything below a .200 batting average is a terrible batter. The story behind that name is a story for another time because now we've got the complicated stuff. OBP is on base percentage. It's how often a player gets on base, so that means not only hits but also walks and when a player gets hit by a pitch. Slugging is a metric that takes batting average and adds extra weight to certain hits that get more bases. So base hits are just 1, but doubles are doubled, triples are tripled, and home runs are quadrupled. This leads into OPS, which is on base plus slugging. Basically, it's just OBP and slugging added together. A lot of people like using this as the definitive stat to rate batters with, as it allows for much more variation and a lot of the best players actually get OPS numbers above 1.0. But the equivalent for the Mendoza line for OPS appears to be around .600. Now for pitching stats. ERA stands for earned runs allowed. An earned run is actually a specific measurement that accounts for runs that are scored due to the pitcher. So they remove runs scored due to legitimate defensive errors, but this also means that any runs scored by players left on base will be counted toward the pitcher who put them on base, whether that pitcher is still pitching or not. An ERA is the average earned runs a pitcher gives up per 9 innings, simulating an entire game. This kind of screws over relievers who spend a lot less time on the mound. So a starter who gives up 3 runs in a complete game has an ERA of 3.0, but a reliever who only pitched for a single inning and gave up just 1 run will have an ERA of 9.0. WHIP is something that works as a slight equalizer to that. WHIP stands for walks and hits per innings pitched. Instead of extrapolating one inning into a full game, it averages everything into just one inning. So let's say a reliever pitches 2 innings and has a game ERA of 4.5, but a WHIP of 0.5. That would be because they pitched really well, but gave up a single solo home run. So as I said, WHIP is kind of an equalizer to the much more heavy-handed ERA. Finally, for pitching, a save is something that is a specific thing for relievers. In order to get a save, certain conditions must be met. First of all, the pitcher's team needs to be winning when the pitcher enters the game. Then, one of 3 things needs to be true. A, the possible tying run for the opposing team is either on base at the plate or is set to bat next. B, the pitcher pitches for at least 1 inning while their team is leading by 3 runs or less. Or C, the pitcher pitches for at least 3 innings. Why is this so complicated? Well, it was actually really simple back in the 50s, but then some journalists decided to complicate it in the early 60s, and somehow MLB decided to make the complicated definition official in 1969 when they clearly decided that they hated pitchers. The final relevant stat is WAR. What is it good for? Well, WAR stands for wins above replacement, and if you thought saves were complicated, whoo boy! Very few people know the formula to calculate WAR offhand, and it's pretty much impossible to calculate it offhand anyway because it relates back to the league averages and needs different calculations for batting, pitching, and even fielding. But it also means that WAR is one of the most comprehensive catch-all ways to value a baseball player. It's supposed to calculate how many wins they provide to the team above a replacement level player. What is a replacement level player? I don't really know. I think it was originally supposed to mean some guy off the streets, but no matter how much Edwin Encarnacion underperformed, I don't think I'd do any better than him. Most likely I'd be worse. So anyone below a 0 is considered replacement level, above 2 makes them a starter, all-stars are usually 5 or above, and over 8 is MVP level. And that's it! That's all the baseball information you'll need to start your journey. This video is kind of all over the place, but I did it so that I could give you as general of an understanding of the game as possible while also giving you some fun facts. I know you're not dumb. Even if you've never seen baseball before, you can infer what position a player is playing based on the lineup and where they're standing on defense. But who's going to tell you what constitutes an earned run or what OPS means? So be sure to impress your friends and family with your newfound knowledge of baseball during spring training, and maybe I'll do more detailed strategy one in the future. But for now, I've got some other plans for the rest of the month. Thank you for watching.